Right-wing populism. If you look at the history of right-wing populism through basically social movement theory, you see throughout American history, going all the way back to the colonial period in Bacon's Rebellion, that white people who are in a middling, precarious position, they're actually in Europe, they use the term precariat as opposed to the proletariat. You have the precariat. Barbara Ehrenreich writes about fear of falling, the life of the middle class. When you have white people who are not elites and don't want to slip lower on the socioeconomic ladder, they develop this concept that they're being squeezed by corrupt elites and parasites up above and lazy, sinful, and subversive parasites down below. And at different points in history, the scapegoats up above and the scapegoats down below change, but the basic story remains the same. So in the Bacon's Rebellion, they like to go out and kill a lot of native people. Great. With a major right-wing populist movement, and I know the Tea Party does not like to be compared to this, I'm just saying in terms of right-wing populist movements in America, the largest one was the 1920s Ku Klux Klan, where there were states taken over by this right-wing populist movement. Now, I'm not saying that the Tea Party is like the Klan. I'm saying that throughout U.S. history, there have been populist movements that scapegoat people up above and people down below. At various times in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the elites, the secret conspiracy of these parasites up above was allegedly run by the Freemasons or the Illuminati. And then at various times, you've seen right-wing populist movements built around anti-Catholic hysteria in the 1800s. If you look at the Palmer raids, 1919 and 1920, started in December, what you see is again, this combination, especially of race and class, because you have to understand that in 1920, Italians and Russians were not white, okay? Irish had become white, but the Italians and the Russians weren't white. And so not only were they all alleged to be anarchists and communists, but they weren't like us because they were not really Northern Europeans, and in 1920, only Northern Europeans counted as white. Things changed slowly over time, and as demographics changed in the U.S., suddenly who's a white person changes. Oh, there's more of us. How fascinating and useful. So that's one of the things that's going on here. So if you look at what happened in the Palmer raids, is that there was basically a panic. There were some acts of terrorism, they were very isolated, and thousands of Italians and Russians were deported.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I just hope that you're doing fine from wherever you're watching us from. Now in today's video, we're going to be seeing a professor called Chip Ballett. He's an American investigative journalist, a researcher and a political analyst known for his work on right-wing movement, conspiracy theories, and authoritarianism. He has written extensive topics like white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and the far-right influence on politics. It's always important for us to have these discussions, and as a person who is interested in understanding this part of learning, it's so much important. And Chip Ballett gives us an understanding of white rage, right? Now, Chip Ballett's analysis on white rage is rooted in the historical and structural forces that shape racial resentment among white populations. He argues that white rage is not an irrational outburst, but a calculated response to perceived threats against white dominance. It manifests when racial groups such as the civil rights movement challenges the established racial hierarchy. Ballett ties this phenomenon to a systemic racism, showing that it fuels reactionary politics and authoritarianism movement. So I want to switch this video. I hope you get to understand the perspective of Chip Ballett, whatever thing he says, and I'm also ready to learn from him, right? Because he talks about right-wing, he talks about right-wing extremism, he talks about the white rage. And all these concepts, I think it's important for people of the United States to understand, especially the origin where the white rage came from. Now, these are presented stories. I hope you'll get to learn. I hope you'll get to see. Remember, all the opinions that I give are research-based. I'm not an expert in this, but just know that everything that I try to share with you is always a research-based fact. So let's watch the video with an open mind, and then I'll be back with my commentary as usual as we learn from the video.
Now, the man who deported these folks, Louis Post, later resigned and wrote a book where he said this was a delirium. It was the title of his book. He said that the vast majority of the people tossed out of the country had done nothing, and they were simply scapegoats. So keep in mind this idea of scapegoating and who's white, because that's a very interesting question. Originally, the idea in sociology and political science about who these folks were is that they were crazy and stupid, and they were a vestigial force, and you have the paranoid style. Hofstadter's writing is actually much more lucid and analytically useful than some of the other people like Bell and Lipset and others, who basically said these folks were maladjusted. And when I was, my brief career taking sociology courses, what I was taught is that people who joined any social movement of the left and right were dysfunctional, marginal people who didn't know how to act in a democratic society, left and right. Well, this was in the 60s, and people who were coming out of the civil rights movement and the student movement and the women's movement were coming back to school into sociology saying, what the? I just spent 5 years in a social movement in the South, and you're telling me it's because I'm maladjusted? So sociology began to overturn these old theories of the classical school and began to look at how people used their various skill sets to basically deal with grievances that they had, and they would form groups to deal with those grievances. And it was like this miraculous discovery that people who joined social movements weren't nuts. But for many years, the right wing was still described it. Well, that's the left wing. So, Cesar Chavez, not nuts. John Birch Society, nuts. And this went on until relatively recently, when people like Michael Paul Rogan and Sarah Diamond, Kathleen Blee, and others and Jerome Himmelstein began to write, actually the people who join right-wing social movements, they just have a different story in their head about what their grievances are and what the real America is. And it always comes back to who is the real America in all of these battles. Now, if you look at right-wing populism over time, you have these elites up above that are constructed as the enemy, and they can be the Rockefeller family, they can be the Jews, they can be the Council on Foreign Relations. The latest one is it's the Bilderberger banking group. This varies with time. In fact, there are elite formations that have a lot of power, but it's not like they're puppeteers. So Holly Sklar, who I've worked with for many years, writes a book on trilateralism about how important they are. But she rejects the idea that the Trilateral Commission runs the world like a clockwork orange. If you look over time at how right-wing populist movements work, they're predominantly white, they're predominantly middle class, and they use the same sets of tools over and over. They use dualism. There's an us and there's a them. There's a real America and there's the people who don't belong. There's demonization. These people are bad. And in some cases they're described as evil, the other, the people who don't belong. Scapegoating, conspiracism, there's always a plot. And what's nice about alleging that your political opponent is involved in a conspiracy is it justifies you taking aggressive action against them to stop the evil conspiracy before it's too late, which brings in the idea of apocalypticism, which is just a fancy word for, oh my God, time is running out, we have to act now. And after we act now, things are going to change, and we're going to find out about all these hidden truths, and history will be made. That's all what apocalypticism means. It can be religious, it can be secular. So if you look at some right-wing studies by right-wingers about the conspiracy and about how the middle-class white people are always under attack, there's actually a book that has a vice. It's a picture of a wood vice, for those who know what those are. And two giant blocks of wood coming together on these little, bolts, essentially. And the middle class is in the middle, being squeezed to death by the parasites above and the parasites below. And in this one, the parasites above are like the Rockefellers, and then the parasites below include the yippies, which sort of dates it, I was in the Zippies. We were the radical splinter group from the yippies. But it's another story. I get enough beer, I talked to about it. So this idea of being squeezed also plays into this idea of apocalyptic fear that things are happening really fast and we have to stop what's happening before we're squeezed to death, essentially. Now, So who is the us and the them, and what's the battle? Now, if you read the Tea Party elite formation, the Dick Armeys, the Republican strategists, they're going to tell you that the Tea Party is just about what their original plan was for the AstroTurf group, which is rolling back big government and lowering taxes. Now, why do they want to do that? Are these folks, even the elites, really against big government? Well, if you ask them if they're against the military, except for the libertarians, who are about 1 to 2% of this crowd, 1 to 2%, what they're going to say is, well, you shouldn't cut the military, and well, you can't cut the police. And what you really get down to is a narrow little wedge of the money pie that has to do with social welfare programs and helping the impoverished and helping folks who are victims of historical oppression. So we're talking about a tiny, tiny sliver that really they want to cut out of government. And as Grover Norquist has put it, what he wants to do is shrink the size of government so it's so small he can strangle it in a bathtub. But he doesn't really mean that, because what he really wants to do is cut out any kind of activity by the government for the common welfare that is not protective in nature. If it's the police, if it's the military, spend billions, trillions, not a problem. So there's a little deceptive thing going on here. If you look at the grassroots, you're going to see that the Tea Party movement was pulled together from a lot of different pre-existing social movements. And again, that's social movement theory 101, that really rapidly growing social movements don't pop up out of nowhere. What you have is a group of organizers running around finding people who are already in a movement, because they're the easiest to organize. You know, saps like me. How many movements am I in? Oh my God. So who got organized? Well, libertarians, absolutely. Again, very important in the first round of organizing for the Tea Party movement, the Ron Paul supporters especially. Some economic libertarians from a variety of different places. But also a lot of the Christian right. The Christian right is about 15% of the voting public, of the people who actually go and vote. And it turns out that they make up a substantial, if hard to nail down, percentage of the folks who joined the Tea Party movement. Gun rights activists, anti-tax activists, people worried about immigration, people worried about unfair disadvantages for white people. We're so oppressed. And so you already had these movements being drawn from. And of course, when you build a movement from pre-existing movements, people bring their own grievances into the main group. And so when you look then at the Tea Party movement, you're seeing a group of people in the grassroots, millions of people at this point, probably 200,000 actual members of Tea Party groups, but millions of people who support the Tea Party groups, with a lot of baggage that they brought into the Tea Party. And meanwhile, the elite formations, which have the ear of Fox News, they're all running around saying this is all about taxes and big government, which is in fact not true. The elites might want that to be true, but it's simply not the case. So what is the grievance, the base grievance of these elite formations? And it's Roosevelt, Franklin D. They don't like what happened to America when Franklin Roosevelt was president. Their whole game here is to roll back the social safety net woven during the Roosevelt administration. That is what they want, and they have been trying to do it since 1933 when Roosevelt was elected. And if you go back and look at that period from 33 to 39, what you're going to see is that there is already a Christian right. There is already a corporate America, Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers. There's already a group of libertarians who at the time called themselves the Austrian School. And they're talking about free markets. And that this is a struggle that starts back in the 1930s. And it's about the proper role of government. And you know, folks, this is a problem we need to resolve in this country. There are two ways of looking at how a country is run. Most industrialized nations have a social safety net of some sort, and we insist on living in a John Wayne, Horatio Alger fantasy. And most of the other industrialized nations around the world look at us like we're a bunch of pea-brains, because they know that what that means is that a certain sector of the society is impoverished. There are poor people because they are impoverished. Sure, there's some freeloaders who hang on in society, but when you design a society that has a certain acceptable level of unemployment, a lot of those unemployed people actually would be happy to work. They just don't know how to get a job. And the role of government is not to ensure bank bailouts for the wealthy, but for the common good. So we have a lot of people who are full of greed, ignoring the needs of the people. And that, I think, is the argument. Now, that's my political point of view, but I think it ties into what we're seeing right now with the Tea Party movement. Now, in the Roosevelt period, the libertarian laissez-faire Austrian school theory was basically, it was anti-collectivist, anti-communist, anti-fascist, and anti-liberalism in the political sense. So that you have basically this guy, Friedrich von Hayek, looking at the English government, the British government at the time, saying this kind of wishy-washy, state interventionist, collectivist, social welfare, mishigosh, not a word he probably used, is really going to destroy this society. And he came up with this theory. Now remember, this is in 1944 when he finally writes this, and it gets published as a book called The Road to Serfdom. And he's been looking at Hitler and Stalin, and he's been looking at fascism and communism. And he basically writes that big government leads to collectivism, collectivism leads to totalitarianism, and totalitarianism is fascism and communism. Therefore, big government, what was the sign? Obama is Hitler and Stalin. And we all laughed at that, except for the millions of people who have Hayek and von Mises and Milton Friedman on their bookshelves, because it's what they've been saying for over 50 years. And there's a large constituency of folks who've been reading that stuff, and they believe it to be true. That doesn't make them stupid, and it doesn't make them crazy. It makes them our political opponent, who we need to struggle with. But they're not crazy and stupid for believing this, because this is a widely held view in the American political right wing. Milton Friedman in the Chicago School is the most obvious example of where this leads. What's interesting is von Mises goes on to work with the John Birch Society and begins to drift towards the idea that this is all a conspiracy, that liberal socialists are taking over the world and have to be stopped to save God and country. But more on that later. Now, what group in America, what right-wing group, has been saying these things all along since 1958? Anyone know? Anyone? I know Joanne knows. The John Birch Society. And where is the John Birch Society today? Appleton, Wisconsin. And who was born just outside of Appleton, Wisconsin? Joe McCarthy. You people have done your homework.
No, we're from Wisconsin.
Oh, you're from Wisconsin. Well, both. I mean, pretty good. Okay, so 1950, Joe McCarthy gives a speech on communism everywhere. The subversives are everywhere. They're in the State Department. They're taking over. It's important to understand that the anti-communist witch hunts are rooted in a kind of old Christian right fear that Bolshevism and anarchism are satanic. An idea that gets deeply rooted around World War I. Frank Donner writes about this, that it becomes a widely accepted view that collectivism and socialism and anarchism are all godless, satanic ideas that will destroy America. And this gets rooted in the fundamentalist movement, which disappears from the public scene after the Scopes monkey trial, because they're very embarrassed, even though they win. Remember that they win the Scopes monkey trial, but they're very embarrassed by people like H.L. Mencken calling them names, and they sort of withdraw from the political scene. But all along, from 1910, 1915, when the fundamentals are developed, which was a list of what it meant to be a Christian, thus the fundamental things Christians believe, thus the birth of the first religious fundamentalist movement, not until 1915, these folks went out of the public view, but they didn't go away, and they remained a core part of right-wing politics in America, even though they tended not to vote at that time, up until the 50s. So Joe McCarthy becomes basically uses this sort of group as a constituency, even though it's not voting. And he engages in a power struggle in Washington. Ultimately, he gets displaced because he oversteps his bounds. But what else is happening in Milwaukee during this period from the time of Roosevelt forward? And it's the Allen Bradley Corporation, that big clock down the road a piece. I don't know where I am. Is it that way? It's somewhere around here. It's that. Oh, boy, I'm lost. Okay. So anyway, the Allen Bradley Corporation is one of these really big corporations. And what do they have in common with some of these groups? Well, they're anti-Roosevelt. They think he's destroying America. They're anti-collectivist. They hate labor unions. And they start to develop with a group of other people over many decades an idea of defending their view of free market capitalism. But this doesn't get started right away. You have an alliance between Christian right publications and libertarian publications in the 1950s, where you actually have, like, von Mises writing for both libertarian publications and Christian right publications. But this is brewing. It's going little by little over time. It hasn't gelled yet. And remember that as a number of scholars have written, before World War II, the American political right was a very fractured group of people who were racist, anti-Semitic, believed in apocalyptic Christian views, and they didn't get along very well. After World War II, several things happened. It became unacceptable to use open anti-Semitic language in the political right. And then William Buckley began to enforce that to a certain degree and began to open the door to the idea that, you know, hanging out with the Ku Klux Klan was a bad idea for conservative political figures. This was a change, because in the 1920s, being anti-Semitic and hanging out with the Klan was A-OK for most conservatives. So Buckley, National Review, actually starts to say, if we're going to take ourselves seriously in rolling back the Roosevelt administration, we're going to have to clean our own kitchen. And a group of conservatives set out to rebuild a conservative coalition around moral traditionalism, anti-communism, and laissez-faire economic theory, free market theories. And basically, and a lot of militarism thrown in. And this becomes what's called fusionism in the 1950s. And this, they then began to try and, you know, restore America back to its pre-Roosevelt plan. Now, what happens? Oh, well, in the 50s, while this is going on, there's still a witch hunt. There's still a Red Scare. Down at the Allen Bradley plant, the FBI has placed an informer in the labor union in an effective plan to help not only root out red subversives, but along the way weaken the union, which is going to make the folks at Allen Bradley really happy. In March 1955, the House Un-American Activities Committee, for purists, it's the House Committee on Un-American Activities, but everyone calls it HUAC. They actually have hearings where they bring the labor spies to the hearings and interview them about these awful things that the Reds are doing in the union. And this is all part of a campaign that starts in the 40s that is aimed originally at labor unions, but later moves to Hollywood to gain a lot of attention, but then goes back to attacking labor unions, to suggest that communist subversion is everywhere in America and it needs to be rooted out. And where do we root it out? Well, first we break a whole bunch of labor unions where there may or may not be communists involved. Then we go after Hollywood, where there were filmmakers talking about social justice and social welfare issues. Oh my God, we can't have that. And then along the way, during the same period, there's homophobia in the fact that if you're gay in the 1950s, the FBI presumes you're an easy target for red recruitment as a spy through blackmail. And so they start going through all the gay people in the Navy, who are mostly stewards, and getting them fired and thrown out of the Navy. Now, I don't know what a guy cooking a potato has got to do with foreign intelligence, but then I'm not a spy. Well, you know, there are all these interesting issues about sexual identity and, you know, repression. But yeah, it's entirely true that there's a substantial amount of evidence that J. Edgar Hoover himself had some issues with his sexuality, which may have led him to be more prone to target homosexuals in an effort to show that he was not one, which is a very common thing, especially for people who are denying their own sexual identity. But the specifics of that are very complicated. What we do know is that the idea of blackmail was used to get rid of not just people in the military, but also in concert with communist sympathies alleged to go through colleges as well. So there was a lot of going on here that was interesting. There was at the time in the military a growing argument that communists, homosexuals, and Jews were all a security risk and were plotting together to take over America. There's actually a wonderful book about this, talking about the zany extent to which certain military officials tried to prove this, and in declassified documents, and looking at this, again, this counter-subversive conspiracy theory. So, okay, so that's 1955. We have HUAC, we have McCarthy, we have trying to bust unions by using red baiting. What else is happening right around then? 1954, we have Brown versus Board of Education, the Topeka School District, and the order for the beginning of desegregation of the public schools. Just sort of park that up there for now, because that takes a while to sort of show itself as an issue here.
Hello folks, welcome back to the channel. I hope you have learned from, the video and its presentation, because as I said, it's not easy. It's a difficult presentation because, things that matters or touches on politics or the right wing or the left wing usually has friction, because not everyone agrees with everything that is being said. So at the end of the day, we have a group of people that will disagree with everything that is being said. Now, when he talks about white supremacy and structural racism, Ballet emphasizes that white rage is deeply embedded in white supremacy, which is not just about individual prejudice, but a structured system of racial advantage. It critiques how white Americans, particularly those in power, have historically responded to black progress with backlash. Remember things such as the Jim Crow laws after the Reconstruction, the war on drugs after the civil rights movement, and the restrictive immigration policies today. It links these reactions to political strategies that reinforce racial hierarchies. He also goes ahead and talks about the role of conspiracy theories. And he says that a crucial aspect of Ballet's research is how conspiracy theories fuel white rage. He examines how narratives like the Great Replacement Theory, they believe that white population are being deliberately replaced by non-white immigrants to create panic amongst white communities, right? These fears amplified by the right-wing media and political figures frame racial diversity as a form of oppression against white people, leading to increased racial animosity and support for exclusionary policies. And he still goes ahead and discusses about the politics of resentment. And here Ballet explains how right-wing movements exploit economic and social anxieties to stroke white rage, right? When working-class white people experience economic decline, rather than blaming corporate elites or systemic issues, they are directed to blame marginalized communities, especially black and immigrant population. This is deliberate. This is a deliberate tactic used by the right-wing political operatives to shift attention away from economic inequality and maintain control. Also, you get to understand the law and order is used as a racial policy. Now, get to understand this. Another key theme in the Ballet's work is use of law and order rhetoric as a tool to justify white rage. He argues that policies like mass incarceration and voter suppression are modern-day versions of racial control. And voter suppression are modern-day versions of racial control. Politicians invoke crime and security concerns to push policies that disproportionately harm black communities, all while presenting these measures as neutral or necessary for public safety. This tactic dates back to Richard Nixon's Southern strategy as it continues today. We also get to see the role of Christian nationalism. Remember, while I talked about this, one of his works is he tried to talk about the role of Christian nationalism, right? Now, Ballet links white rage to Christian nationalism, where religious identity is weaponized to justify racial and cultural supremacy. And he goes ahead and examines how conservative religious movements frame white Christians as true Americans and paint racial diversity as a threat to national identity. This ideology fuels resistance to progressive social changes such as the LGBTQ rights and racial equity policies under the guise of defending traditional values. And also get to look at the far-right extremism and white rage. One of Ballet's major concerns is how white rage fuels far-right-wing extremism. It discusses how nationalist groups like the KU, Klux Klan, and modern militia movements have historically emerged during periods of racial progress. The resurgence of extremist violence in recent years, including attacks on black churches and mosques, reflect a reactionary attempt to reassert white dominance. Also, he goes ahead and discusses about media and amplification of white rage. Media, especially the role of the social media, is making these, especially the mainstream media, is making this so much hard for peace to be there. Now, Ballet critiques the role of media, particularly right-wing outlets like Fox News, in amplifying white rage. Right? He argues that conservative media frames white people as victims of reverse racism, portraying diversity efforts as attacks on their rights. This messaging creates a climate of fear and justifies racist policies, all while avoiding direct racial language. He calls this dog whistle politics, where coded language is used to stroke racial resentment without overtly racist rhetoric. In his works, he also talks about economic decline and white rage, while acknowledging that economic struggles impact all races. Ballet points out that white rage often arises from white communities, a sense of lost privilege. Right? Not just economic hardship. It critiques how political leaders manipulate these frustrations by convincing white voters that their decline status is due to government policies favoring minorities rather than corporate greed or neoliberal economic shifts, right? And so that was all I had to say in regards to the summary of what is shared with everybody. I'd like you to tell me what you think about this. It's really important for me to understand and get your perspective in what you say about this. As you know, these are presenter Jintok Stories, and I'm hoping to see you in my next video. For those who are watching us for the first time, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get to see what we can offer you. For those who wish to support me, for those who wish to buy me a coffee, you could check out my Cash App account is on my bio. You could send me some things. I'll be still grateful. I'm really thankful for all the support that all of you are giving me. But until then, I'm hoping to see you in my next video. As you know, these are presenter Jintok Stories. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salut.